Frankenstein, chapters 4 and 5. From this day, natural philosophy, and particularly chemistry in the most comprehensive sense of the term, became nearly my sole occupation. I read with ardor those works so full of genius discrimination, which modern inquirers have written on these subjects. I attended the lectures and cultivated the acquaintance of men of science of the university, and I found even in M. Kemp a great deal of sound sense and real information, combined, it is true, with a repulsive physiognomy with manners, but not on the account of the less vulnerable. In M. Waldman, I found a true friend. His gentleness was never tinged by my dogmatism, and his instructions were given with an air of frankness and good nature that banished every idea of pedantry. In a thousand ways, he smoothed for me the path of knowledge and made the most abstruse inquiries clear and facile to my apprehension. My application was at first fluctuating and uncertain. It gained strength as I proceeded, and soon became so ardent and eager that the stars often disappeared in the night of mornings whilst I was yet engaged in my laboratory. As I applied so closely, it may be easily conceived that my progress was rapid. My ardor was indeed the astonishment of the students, and my proficiency that of the masters. Professor Kemp often asked me, with a sly smile, how Cornelius Agrippa went on, whilst M. Waldman expressed the most heartfelt exultation of my progress. 2 years passed in this manner, during which I paid no visit to Geneva, but was engaged, heart and soul, in the pursuit of some discoveries which I hoped to make. None but those who have experienced them can conceive of the enticements of science. In other studies, you go as far as others have gone before you, and there is nothing more to know. But in a scientific pursuit, there is a continual food for discovery and wonder. A mind of moderate capacity, which closely pursues one study, must infallibly arrive at great proficiency in that study. And I, who continually sought the attainment of one subject of pursuit, and was solely wrapped up in this, improved so rapidly that at the end of 2 years I made some discoveries in the improvement of some chemical instruments, which procured me great esteem and admiration at the university. When I had arrived at this point, and had become as well acquainted with the theory and practice of natural philosophy as depended on the lessons of any of the professors at Ingolstadt, my residence there being no longer conducive to my own improvement, I had thought of returning to my friends in my native town, when an incident happened that protracted my stay. One of the phenomena which had peculiarly attracted my attention was the structure of the human frame, and indeed any animal endued with life. Whence, I often asked myself, did the principle of life proceed? It was a bold question, and one which was ever been considered as a mystery. Yet with how many things are we upon the brink of becoming acquainted, if cowardice or carelessness did not restrain our inquiries? I resolved these circumstances in my mind, and determined thenceforth to apply myself more particularly to those branches of natural philosophy which relates to physiology. Unless I had been animated by my almost supernatural enthusiasm, my application to the study would have been irksome and almost intolerable. To examine the causes of life, we must first have recourse to death. I became acquainted with the science of anatomy, but this was not sufficient. I must also observe the natural decay and corruption of the human body. In my education, my father had taken the greatest precautions that my mind should be impressed with no supernatural horrors. I do not ever remember to have trembled at natural horrors. I do not ever to remember to have trembled at a tale of superstition, or to have feared the apparition of a spirit. Darkness had no effect upon my fancy, and a churchyard was to me merely the receptacle of bodies deprived of life, which, from being the seat of beauty and strength, had become food for the worm. Now I was led to examine the cause and progress of this decay, and forced to spend days and nights in vaults and charnel houses. My attention was fixed upon every object the most insupportable to the delicacy of the human feelings. I saw how the fine form of a man was degraded and wasted. I beheld the corruption of death succeed to the blooming cheek of life. I saw how the worm inherited the wonders of the eye and brain. I paused, examining and analyzing all the minutiae of causation, as exemplified in the change from life to death and death to life, until from the midst of the darkness a sudden light broke in upon me, a light so brilliant and wondrous, yet so simple that while I became dizzy with the immensity of the prospect which it illustrated, I was surprised that among so many men of genius who had directed their inquiries toward the same science, that I alone should be reserved to discover so astonishing a secret. Remember, I am not recording the vision of a madman. The sun does not more certainly shine in the heavens than which I now affirm is true. Some miracle might have produced it, yet the stages of the discovery were distinct and probable. After days and nights of incredible labor and fatigue, I succeeded in discovering the cause of generation and life. Nay, more, I became myself capable of bestowing animation upon lifeless matter. The astonishment which I had at first experienced on this discovery soon gave place to delight and rapture. After so much time spent in painful labor, to arrive at once at the summit of my desires was the most gratifying consumption of my toils. But this discovery was so great and overwhelming that all the steps by which I had been progressively led to it were obliterated, and I beheld only the result. What had been the study and desire of the wisest men since the creation of the world was now within my grasp. Not that not like a magic science, it all opened upon me at once. The information I had obtained was of a nature rather to direct my endeavors so soon as I should point them towards the object of my search, than to exhibit that object already accomplished. I was like the Arabian who had been buried with the dead and found a passage to life, aided only by the glimmering and seemingly ineffectual light. I see by your eagerness and the wonder and hope which your eyes express, my friend, that you expect to be informed of the secret with which I am acquainted. That cannot be. Listen patiently until the end of my story, and you will easily perceive why I am reserved upon that subject. I will not lead you on, unguarded and ardent as I was then. Instruction and infallible misery. Learn from me, if not from my precepts, at least from my example. How dangerous is the acquirement of knowledge, and how much happier that man is who believes his native town to be the world than he who aspires to become greater than his nature will allow. When I found so astonishing a power placed within my hands, I hesitated a long time concerning the manner in which I should employ it. Although I possessed the capacity of bestowing animation, yet to prepare a frame for the reception of it, with all its intricacies of fibers, muscles, and veins, still remained a work of inconceivable difficulty and labor. I doubted at first whether I should attempt the creation of a being like myself, or one of simpler organization. But my imagination was too much exalted by my first success to permit me to doubt of my ability to give life to an animal as complex and wonderful as man. The materials at present within my command hardly appeared adequate to so arduous an undertaking. But I doubted not that I should ultimately succeed. I prepared myself for a multitude of reverses. My operations might be incessantly baffled, but at last my work be imperfect. Yet, when I considered the improvement which every day takes place in science and mechanics, I was encouraged to hope my present attempts would at least lay the foundations of future successes. Nor could I consider the magnitude and complexity of my plan as any argument of its impracticability. It was with these feelings that I began the creation of a human being. As the minuteness of the parts formed a great hindrance to my speed, I resolved, contrary to my first intention, to make the being of a gigantic stature, that is to say, about 8 feet in height and proportionately large. After having formed this determination and having spent some months in successfully collecting and arranging my materials, I began. No one can conceive the variety of feelings which bore me onward like a hurricane in the first enthusiasms of success. Life and death appeared to me ideal bounds which I should first break through and pour a torrent of light into our dark world. A new species would bless me as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs. Pursuing these reflections, I thought if I could bestow animation upon lifeless matter, I might, in process of time, although I now found it impossible, renew life where death had apparently devoted the body of corruption. These thoughts supported my spirits while I pursued my undertaking, my unremitting ardor. My cheek had grown pale with study, and my person had become emaciated with confinement. Sometimes on the very brink of certainty I failed, yet still I clung to the hope which the next day or the next hour might realize. One secret which I alone possessed was the hope to which I had dedicated myself, and the moon gazed on my midnight labors, while with unrelaxed and breathless eagerness I pursued nature to her hiding places. Who shall conceive the horrors of my secret toil as I dabbled among the unhallowed damps of the grave, or tortured the living animal to animate the lifeless clay? My limbs now tremble and my eyes swim with the remembrance. But then a restlessness and almost frantic impulse urged me forward. I seemed to have lost all soul or sensation but for this one pursuit. It was indeed but a passing trance that only made me feel with renewed acuteness so soon as the unnatural stimulus ceasing to operate. I had returned to my old habits. I collected bones from the charnel houses and disturbed with profane fingers the tremendous secrets of the human frame. In a solitary chamber, or rather cell at the top of the house, and separated from all the apartments by a gallery and staircases, I kept my workshop of filthy creation. My eyeballs were starting from their sockets and attending to the details of my employment. The dissecting room was and the slaughterhouse furnished many of my materials, and often did my human nature turn with loathing from my occupation, whilst still urged on by my eagerness, which perpetually increased, I brought my work near to a conclusion. The summer months passed while I was thus engaged, heart and soul in one pursuit. It was a most beautiful season. Never did the fields bestow a more plentiful harvest, or the vines yield a more vibrant vintage, but my eyes were insensible to the charms of nature. And the same feelings which made me neglect the scenes around me caused me also to forget those whose friends were so many miles absent, and whom I had not seen for so long a time. I knew my silence disquieted them, and I well remember the words of my father. I know that while you are pleased with yourself, you will think of us with affection, and we shall hear regularly from you. You must pardon me if I regard any interruption in your correspondence as a proof that your other duties are equally neglected. I knew, therefore, what would be my father's feelings, but I could not tear my thoughts from my employment, loathsome in itself, but which had taken an irresistible hold of my imagination. I wished, as it were, to procrastinate all that related to my feelings of affection until the great object, which swallowed up every habit of my nature, should be completed. I then thought that my father would be unjust if he ascribed my neglect to vice or faultiness on my part. But I am now convinced that he was justified in conceiving that I should not be altogether free from blame. A human being in perfection ought to always to preserve a calm and peaceful mind, and never to allow passion or transitory desire to disturb this tranquillity. I did not think that the pursuit of knowledge is an exception to this rule. If the study to which you apply yourself has a tendency to weaken your affections and to destroy your taste for those simple pleasures in which no alloy can possibly mix, then the study is certainly unlawful, that is to say, not befitting the human mind. If this rule were always observed, if no man allowed any pursuit whatsoever to interfere with the tranquillity of his domestic affections, Greece had not been enslaved. Caesar would have spared his country. America would have been discovered more gradually, and the empires of Mexico and Peru had not been destroyed. But I forget that I am normalizing in the most interesting part of my tale, and your look reminds me to proceed. My father made no reproach in his letters, and only took notice of my silence by inquiring into my occupations more particularly than before. Winter, spring, and summer passed away during my labors, but I did not watch the blossom or the expanding leaves. Sights were before always yielded me supreme delight. So deeply was I engrossed in my occupation. The leaves of that year had withered before my work drew near to a close, and now every day showed me more plainly how well I had succeeded. But my enthusiasm was checked by my anxiety, and I appeared rather like one doomed by slavery to toil in the mines or any other unwholesome trade than an artist occupied by his favorite employment. Every night I was oppressed by a slow fever, and I became nervous to a most painful degree. The fall of a leaf startled me, and I shunned my fellow creatures as if it had been guilty of a crime. Sometimes I grew alarmed at the wreck I perceived that I had become. The energy of my purpose alone sustained me. My labors would soon end, and I believed that exercise and amusement would drive me away incipient disease, and I promised myself both of these when my creation should be complete. Chapter 5. It was on a dreary night in November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 in the morning. The rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burned out. When, by the glimmer of the half extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive emotion agitated its limbs. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe? Or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had neglected his features as beautiful. I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful! Great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness. But these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with the watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. The different accidents of life are not so changeable as the feelings of human nature. I had worked hard for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. For this I was deprived myself of rest and health. I desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation, but now that I had finished it, the beauty of the dream vanished, and the breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Unable to endure the aspect of the being I had created, I rushed out of the room and continued a long time traversing my bedchambers, unable to compose my mind to sleep. At length, lassitude succeeded to the tumult I had before endured, and I threw myself on the bed in my clothes, endeavoring to seek a few moments of forgetfulness. But it was in vain. I slept, indeed, but I was disturbed by the wildest dreams. I thought I saw Elizabeth in the bloom of health walking in the street of Ingolstadt. Delighted and surprised, I embraced her, but as I imprinted the first kiss on her lips, they became livid with the hue of death. Her features appeared to change, and I thought that I held the corpse of my dead mother in my arms. A shroud enveloped her form, and I saw the grave worms crawling in the folds of her flannel. I started from my sleep with horror. A cold dew covered my forehead. My teeth chattered, and every limb became convulsed. When, by the dim and yellow light on the moon, as it forced its way through the window shutters, I beheld the wretch, the miserable monster whom I had created. He held up the curtain of the bed, and his eyes, if they had been called, were fixed on me. His jaws opened, and he muttered some inarticulate sounds, while a grin wrinkled his cheeks. He might have spoken, but I did not hear. One hand was stretched out, seemingly to detain me, but I escaped and rushed downwards. I took refuge in the courtyard belonging to the house which I inhabited, where I remained during the rest of the night, walking up and down in the greatest agitation, listening attentively, catching and fearing each sound as if it were to announce the approach of the demoniacal corpse to which I had so miserably given life. Oh no, no mortal support the horror. Excuse me. Oh no, no mortal could support the horror of that countenance. A mummy again endued with animation could not be so hideous as that wretch. I gazed on him while unfinished. He was ugly then, but when those muscles and joints were rendered capable of motion, it became a thing such as even Dante could not have conceived. I passed the night wretchedly. Sometimes my pulse beat so quickly and hardly that I felt the palpitation in every artery. At others, I nearly sank to the ground through languor and extreme weakness. Mingled with this horror, I felt the bitterness of disappointment. Dreams that had been my food and pleasant rest for so long a space were now become a hell to me, and the change was so rapid, the overthrow so complete. Morning, dismal and wet, at length dawned and discovered to my sleepless and aching eyes the church of Ingolstadt. Its white steeple and clock, which dictated the 6th hour, the porter opened the gates of the court which had that night been in my asylum, and I issued into the streets, pacing them with quick steps, as if I sought to avoid the wretch whom I feared ever turning on the street would present to my view. I did not dare return to the apartment which I inhabited, but felt impelled to hurry on, although drenched by the rain which poured from a black and comfortless sky. I continued walking in this manner for some time, endeavoring by bodily exercise to ease the load that weighed upon my mind. I traversed the streets without any clear conception of where I was or what I was doing. My heart palpitated in the sickness of fear, and I hurried on with irregular steps, not daring to look about me. Like one who on a lonely road doth walk in fear and dread, and having once turned round walks on, and turns no more his head, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread. That's an excerpt from Coleridge's Ancient Mariner. Continuing thus, I came at length opposite to the inn in which the various diligences and carriages usually stopped. Here I paused, I knew not why, but I remained some minutes with my eyes fixed on a coach that was coming towards me from the other end of the street. As it drew nearer, I observed that it was the Swiss diligence. I stopped just where I was standing, and on the door being opened, I perceived Henry Clerval, who, on seeing me, instantly sprung out. "My dear Frankenstein," exclaimed he, "how glad I am to see you! How fortunate that you should be here at the very moment of my alighting!" Nothing could equal my delight on seeing Clerval. His presence brought back to my thoughts my father, Elizabeth, and all those scenes of home so dear to my recollection. I grasped his hand and in a moment forgot my horror and misfortune. I felt suddenly, and for the first time during many months, calm and serene joy. I welcomed my friend, therefore, in the most cordial manner, and we walked towards my college. Clerval continued talking for some time about our mutual friends and his own good fortune in being permitted to come to Ingolstadt. "You may easily believe," said he, "how great was the difficulty to persuade my father that all necessary knowledge was not comprised in the noble art of bookkeeping, and indeed I believe I left him incredulous to the last, for his constant answer to my unwearied entreaties was the same as that of the Dutch schoolmaster and the vicar of Wakefield. I have 10,000 florins a year without Greek, I eat heartily without Greek. But his affection for me at length overcame his dislike of learning, and he has permitted me to undertake a voyage of discovery to the land of knowledge. It gives me the greatest delight to see you. But tell me how you left my father, brothers, and Elizabeth." "Very well, and very happy, only a little uneasy that they hear from you so seldom. By the by, I mean to lecture you a little upon your account myself. But, my dear Frankenstein," continued he, stopping short and gazing full in my face, "I did not before remark how very ill your appearance. So thin and pale. You look as if you have been watching for several nights." "You've guessed right. I have lately been so deeply engaged in one occupation that I have not allowed myself sufficient rest, as you see. But I sincerely hope, that all these employments are now at an end, and that I am at length free." I trembled excessively. I could not endure to think of, and far less to allude to, the occurrences of the preceding night. I walked with a quick pace, and we soon arrived at my college. I then reflected, and the thought made me shiver that the creature whom I had left in my apartment might still be there, alive and walking about. I dreaded to behold this monster, but I feared still more that Henry should see him. Entreating him, therefore, to remain a few minutes at the bottom of the stairs, I darted up towards my room. My hand was already on the lock of the door before I recollected myself. I then paused, and a cold shivering came over me. I threw the door forcibly open, as children are accustomed to do when they are experience a spectre to stand in waiting for them on the other side. But nothing appeared. I stepped fearfully in. The apartment was empty, and my bedroom was also freed from its hideous guest. I could hardly believe that so great a good fortune could have befallen me. But when I became assured that my enemy had indeed fled, I clapped my hands for joy and ran down to Clerval. We ascended into my room, and the servant presently brought breakfast, but I was unable to contain myself. It was not joy only that possessed me. I felt my flesh tingle with excess of sensitiveness, and my pulse beat rapidly. I was unable to remain for a single instant in the same place. I jumped over the chairs, clapped my hands, and laughed aloud. Clerval at first attributed my unusual spirits to joy on his arrival, but when he observed me more attentively, he saw a wildness in my eyes for which he could not account, and my loud, unrestrained, heartless laughter frightened and astonished him. "My dear Victor," he cried, "what for God's sake is the matter? Do not laugh in that manner. How ill are you? What is the cause of all this?" "Do not ask me," cried I, putting my hands before my eyes, for I thought I saw the dreadful spectre glide into the room. "He can tell. Oh, save me, save me!" I imagined that the monster seized me. I struggled furiously and fell down in a fit. Poor Clerval. What must have been his feelings? A meeting which he anticipated with such joy so strangely turned to bitterness? But I was not the witness of his grief. for I was lifeless and did not recover my senses for a long, long time. This was the commencement of a nervous fever which confined me for several months. During all that time, Henry was my only nurse. I afterwards learned that, knowing my father's advanced age and unfitness for a long journey, and how wretched my sickness would make Elizabeth, he spared them this grief by concealing the extent of my disorder. He knew that I could not have a more kind and attentive nurse than himself, and firm in the hope he felt of my recovery, he did not doubt that, instead of doing harm, he performed the kindest action that he could towards them. But I was in reality very ill, and surely nothing but the unbounded and unremitting attentions of my friend could have restored me to life. The form of the monster on whom I had bestowed existence was forever before my eyes, and I raved incessantly concerning him. Doubtless my words surprised Henry. He at first believed them to be the wanderings of my disturbed imagination, but the pertinacity with which I continually recurred to the same subject persuaded him that my disorder indeed owed its origin to some uncommon and terrible event. By very slow degrees, and with frequent relapses that alarmed and grieved my friend, I recovered. I remember the first time I became capable of observing outward objects with any kind of pleasure. I perceived that the fallen leaves had disappeared and that the young buds were shooting forth from the trees that shaded my window. It was a divine spring, and the season contributed greatly to my convalescence. It also felt sentiments of joy and affection revive in my bosom. My gloom disappeared, and in a short time I became as cheerful as before I was attacked by the fatal passion. Dearest Clerval, I explained, how kind, how very good you are to me. This whole winter, instead of being spent in study, as you promised yourself, has been consumed in my sick room. How shall I ever repay you? I feel the greatest remorse for the disappointment of which I have been occasion, but you will forgive me. You will repay me entirely if you do not discompose yourself, but get well as fast as you can, and since you appear in such good spirits, I may speak to you on one subject, may I not? I trembled. One subject. What could it be? Could he allude to the object on whom I dared not even think? Compose yourself, said Clerval, who observed my change of color. I will not mention it if it agitates you, but your father and cousin would be very happy if they received a letter from you in your own handwriting. They hardly know how ill you have been and are uneasy at your long silence. Is that all, my dear Henry? How could you suppose that my first thought would not fly towards those dear, dear friends whom I love and who are so deserving of my love? If this is your present temper, my friend, will you perhaps be glad to see a letter that has been lying here some days for you? It is from your cousin, I believe. Boom, boom, boom. We'll stop there. All right, so chapters 4 and 5, this is what most people think of when they think of Frankenstein. They think of Frankenstein creating the creature and the horror that ensues. So some of the key parts in this chapter, first of all, whenever he has this great simile, but in a scientific pursuit, there is a continual food for discovery and wonder. I think that's fascinating. So he spent 2 years at the university learning about the natural sciences, and at this point he got to where he had surpassed, his knowledge had surpassed those of his instructors, and so he was considering leaving, but he decided that he was going to try to bring life out of a dead body. So he starts focusing his studies on examining the cause of life. In order to examine the cause of life, you must discover death. And so he starts looking into the science of anatomy. One of my favorite lines, he says, darkness had no effect upon my fancy, and a churchyard was to me merely the receptacle of bodies deprived of life, which from being the seat of beauty and strength have become food for the worm. Remember, this is written in the early to mid 1800s. People weren't writing. I mean, yes, there was some Gothic literature being written around this time, but it wasn't common. I mean, we didn't have a Stephen King. We didn't have horror things as prominent, especially not from a female writer. So this was a very bold undertaking for Mary Shelley and groundbreaking. He states, I became myself capable of bestowing animation upon lifeless matter. The astonishment which I had first experienced on this discovery soon gave place to delight and rapture. He was so excited. But he also pauses at about, I don't know, how many pages in are we? 3 pages in to this chapter. He reminds us that we're in a framed story. So Victor stops his narration and looks at Robert, who he's telling the story to, based upon the letters at the beginning. I see your eagerness and the wonder and hope which your eyes express, my friend, that you expect to be informed of the secret. Um, you are surely expecting me to tell you about the secret of life, but I'm not going to tell you that. I'm not going to burden you with this horrible thing that I discovered and has ruined my life. How dangerous is the acquirement of knowledge, and how much happier than man is who believes his native town to be the world than he who aspires to become greater than his nature will allow. I wish I could be ignorant and naive and be happy with a simple life and had never explored the things that were greater than I should ever know. He explains why he makes the creature huge. So he makes it 8 feet tall because working with the intricacies of the human body on such a minute scale were too challenging. Um, and we've got another simile here. No one can conceive the variety of feelings which bore me onwards like a hurricane. Then he goes on to talk about his naive, innocent hope of developing a new species that would bless him as its creator. No father could claim the gratitude of this child. Okay, if you zoom out and look at this story, Victor is the father of this creature. He creates life, he gives it life, he is its father. And then, as we see in chapter 5, the moment that this creature reaches out to him, he repels him. He's so appalled at the sight of this creature, he flees from it in disgust and horror and abandons this new life form, which is essentially an infant, a brand newborn child. He's completely abandoned to the world in this hideous body, this image that's going to freak people out, and yet his own father has rejected him. And so in chapter 4, he talks about no father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs. And yet, when he has the opportunity to be this parent, this father to this child, he does the exact opposite. And his goal is to renew life where death had apparently devoted the body to corruption. So he wants to be able to not only prevent disease, but be able to bring dead bodies back to life. He gets into how he becomes so consumed with his studies that he becomes sickly and ill. There's some great imagery there. He says, "Who shall conceive the horrors of my secret toil as I dabbled among the hollowed damps of the grave, or tortured the living to animate to lifeless clay?" Again, just beautiful writing in here. I kept my workshop of filthy creation. Often did my human nature turn with loathing from my occupation. So he's disgusted by what he's having to do in cutting apart, digging up these dead bodies, cutting them apart, and working with them in his workshop. But he was so driven by this desire that he was able to overcome his repulsion. And he neglected his friends and family during this time. He goes on to say, a human being in perfection ought always to preserve a calm and peaceful mind, and never to allow passion or a transitory desire to disturb his tranquility. This strikes me very much of the Victorian age of everything is about appearance, everything is about staying calm, everything is about preserving this calm and peaceful mind, never to be seen as anything other than tranquil. And he is driven to insanity almost. If the study to which you apply yourself has a tendency to weaken your affections and to destroy your taste for those simple pleasures in which no alloy can possibly mix, then that study is certainly unlawful, and that is to say, not befitting the human mind. If what you are pursuing is driving you out of tranquility, it is driving you to the verge of madness or excitement or agitation, then that's evil or bad. That's what society was saying. So it's interesting to see what Mary Shelley might be saying about Victorian society in this story. She and her husband did not fit into Victorian society. They were the subject of scandal and gossip rags all over Europe because he had run away with her while he was still married. She was young, and yet he ran away with her. And then as they're traversing about, and Percy Bysshe Shelley had been kicked out of college for being an atheist. There were rumors that he was in the school of Satan, is what they called him and his friends. And allegedly, he might have even been having an affair with Mary Shelley's half sister. So They were also called, he and Lord Byron, this group that was traveling around together. Some of the gossip rags were calling them the League of Incest. So there's a lot of negativity going on regarding Mary Shelley and her traveling companions and her husband, that are in sharp contrast to the social norms of Victorian England and Victorian Europe. And here we've got Victor Frankenstein, who's talking about how he doesn't fit in with those things. A really interesting line here, basically, if this rule were always observed, America would have been discovered more gradually. To me, that's an interesting jab at America, this taking over of the nation of the indigenous people by force, because the passions of the explorers were driving them to do this, even though it was detrimental to another people group. That's how I interpreted that. Winter, spring, and summer passed away during my labors. So he is just frantic working during this year. And another simile here, I appeared rather like one doomed by slavery to toil in the mines. Okay, so we get to chapter 5. Chapter 5 opens with a dark and stormy night. One of the archetypes in literature is rain. So fire brings purity and rain brings new life. And so, of course, it's raining on this night when the creature is brought to life. That's incredible symbolism there. That's a Jungian archetype. Not only is the rain falling down, but his candle is nearly burned out. So the candle could be, I said that fire brings purity, but also light, bringing enlightenment. And yet this light is almost burnt out. He sees the horrid contrast of the watery eyes. The eyes are looking up at him as life is being brought to life. He spent 2 years working on this. Now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. So we've got this antithetical statement, or it's not really the right word, juxtaposition within one sentence, where we have the beauty of the dream contrasted with the breathless horror and disgust. And he runs out of the room. He abandons his new child. He finally falls asleep and starts having these nightmares where he sees Elizabeth and he runs to her and holds her and gives her a kiss. And then he realizes that she's dead. And then he realizes that she's his dead mother, and grave worms are crawling in the folds of her flannel. That's pretty gross. Remember Victorian England. And then he opens his eyes and he sees his child, this creature. Maybe it's ugly, but he sees his child standing at his bed, pulling back the bed curtains. And he describes it as, I beheld the wretch, the miserable monster whom I had created. So in one sentence, he's acknowledging that this is his creation and calling it a wretch and a monster. His jaw opened and he muttered inarticulate sounds with a grin wrinkling his cheeks. Of course they are inarticulate sounds. He's a newborn. And he describes it as the demoniacal corpse to which I had so miserably given life. A mummy, again endued with animation, could not be so hideous as that wretch. Dante, who wrote Dante's Inferno, could not even have conceived such a horrible thing. Dreams that had been my food and pleasant rest for so long a space were now become a hell to me. So the dreams had been a food is a nice metaphor. He goes into the gates of the courtyard that had become his asylum, another metaphor there. And then he's drenched in rain, and again, rain can bring purification, cleansing. It's often a demarcation of something new starting. New life often comes with rain. And so we're going to see here, there's this shift. His life has been in one direction. Here's the rain, and now his life is going to start in a different journey. And it's almost kind of cleansing him of this journey and starting this intermediary part, kind of like a parenthetical season where he's no longer focused on creating the monster, and he's actually going to try to forget the monster. I'm saying monster. I meant to say creature. So he goes to an inn, and here comes this carriage, and out pops, coincidentally, dramatic irony, Henry Clerval just happens to show up at the very moment, and for the first time ever, he feels calmness and serene joy when he sees his friend Henry. He takes Henry back to his apartment, and he's scared to death that the enemy would be there, the enemy being the creature, and the enemy was not there. And he basically goes into this fever illness for several months, and Henry is there to try to nurse him back to health. He says, "The form of the monster on whom I bestowed existence was forever before my eyes during this season." And whenever he wakes up, Henry is there to help him and support him. Henry had convinced his father to allow him to come to Ingerstall to go to college. And instead of attending classes, he spent several months nursing Victor back to health. And when Victor finally awakes, Henry says, "I need you to do one thing for me. Can you write a letter to your father and your sister/cousin, explaining to them that you're okay? And oh, by the way, here's a letter that was just delivered to you." And that's the end of chapter 5. Thank you. I love you dearly. Please subscribe to my channel, and we'll be back to read the next couple of chapters very soon.